AngularJS, what is it? Well, we like to say it's what a web browser would have been had it been designed for web applications, right? Because if you look at web browser, it's a wonderful thing. It does a lot of different things, but the whole web app thing is really an afterthought. Really, it's not what it was really meant for. So what is it? First of all, it's a JavaScript library that's written purely in JavaScript, so any browser will be just fine. It's open source, available on GitHub under MIT license, and we are Google funded. So actually Google's paying my paycheck to work on this full time, and there's actually 3 of us full time who are working on this. So we're hopefully going to be around for a while. And we want to take a completely different way, a different look at building web apps. So what's specifically the problem that we're trying to solve, which is, why is it that building web apps is so difficult? You know, who thinks that building web apps is perfect and there's nothing to be changed? Nobody, okay, good. So web apps is actually a tricky thing because you need to know a lot about the way web browsers work to build anything. And the reason for that is really just the history, right? You know, 89, we get HTML, and really HTML is meant for static documents, for sharing static content, and for that, HTML shines. You know, it's wonderful at it. Comes 95, we get JavaScript, you know, originally meant for doing a little bit of form validation, nothing crazy. And then about 2005, people figured out, like, you know, you could build some serious apps with this thing. And it's amazing that using primitive tools available to people in 2005, you know, they were able to build crazy things like Gmail and Google Maps. So now it's 2011, and the question is, what's different? Well, what's different is that our JavaScript engines are super fast. You know, I saw some charts, something like 300-fold increase in speed of JavaScript execution. That's pretty impressive, right? But fundamentally, the way you build an application today and the way you built it, you know, 5 years ago, an Ajax-style application, hasn't changed. There's no new abstraction levels that have been produced. And so you say, well, yeah, but aren't there already all these different technologies, choose your alphabet soup, that solve this particular problem? Well, I think that you could separate the world into 3 different kind of categories. One set of technologies basically treats the browser as a dumb terminal. You know, that's where all the magic happens on a server, and then you have a round-trip classical app. We're not interested in building those apps. You know, these are not the apps you're looking for. Then you have another set of technologies, jQuery falls squarely in them, which is DOM manipulators. Or if you're thinking about it, libraries like jQuery, you know, John has done an amazing job with jQuery. We love it. It's so terse and everything. But if you think about it, jQuery shouldn't have existed if the web browsers did their job right, right? jQuery is a patch on top of browsers to unify them and to make working with DOM bearable. And finally, there's a third kinds of technologies that basically give up on HTML and CSS, and they say, you know, HTML and CSS is just too complicated in JavaScript, and we're just going to abstract you away from it. And so technologies like XJS, Cappuccino, Sproutcore are perfect examples of it, where building a web app is pleasurable in these technologies, but it's not really building HTML, CSS. It's not what the web was intended for. Well, not intended for, but it's not where the web should be going. So what we want is we want a technology which embraces JavaScript, embraces HTML, embraces CSS, and says this is the way to build app, but at the same time make it easier. So let me give you examples. This is what I love about HTML, right? It's declarative. You want to do a Hello World app, it's super simple. You do p tag, you know exactly what's happening. This is a Hello World in JavaScript. Okay, this is ridiculous. This is the craziest, most complicated Hello World you can possibly have written in any language. I think this beats everything. Let me just go through it just to kind of point out how complex this is, right? So you have your p tag, which eventually you're going to write stuff into. This is where it says greeting. Now, you can't just write to it because JavaScript gets to execute before the DOM actually loads. So you have to register a onDOM ready event. You guys are familiar with this, right? Okay, you have to register onDOM ready event, and then once you register onDOM ready event, you have to wait for, you have to get a hold of the p element you want to write into, and then once you get a hold of it, you can write into it. And of course, this is done differently on most browsers than it is done on IE. So you have to have all this crazy code to make it compatible with IE as well, right? This is crazy. How many people think that this is good? Okay, I saw the hand going up for a second. This is completely insane. So comes jQuery, right? And you go like, it's so much easier to read. You know, I understand what's going on. It's terse. True, it is easier to read. It's more terse. But if you think about it, nothing has fundamentally changed, right? You still have to wait for the DOM to load. You still have to get a hold of the P element you're going to write to. And you still have to write a text. So the code below produces the output that you see up here, right? So jQuery helps a lot, but it doesn't change the mental model of how browsers work. And this is what we're trying to do, is we're trying to say, let's go a level higher. So what I really want to do in AngularJS is to simply say, look, in order to do hello world, there's a variable called greeting. I want to assign to that variable, and wherever I want to place this variable, I just want to have data binding. I want to have double curlies and say, this is where the variable should go, right? Now, you look at this and you go like, yep, that's simple. It's declarative. It's clear. This actually will produce the output you see on the top. But you say at this point, yeah, Miško, but you know, the trouble is that you're mixing concerns, right? You need to have separate code and the view. So really a more canonical way of doing this is to say the P tag is controlled by a controller, in this case, a greeting controller. And inside of it, there's a binding location, which is the greet. And a greeting controller is simply a class that we're all familiar with in JavaScript. In this case, it's just a constructor function that says, you know, take the hello world, assign it to a greeting, and then that becomes automatically assigned to the bind location. Now notice what's missing out of this example. What's missing is the problem of you have to wait until the DOM is loaded. That's gone. Also what's missing is how do I get hold of the P element, right? There's no longer the problem of how do I get hold of my elements, usually in jQuery that's sold using CSS selectors, so that I can write into the DOM. And the trouble with the CSS selectors is they make very tight coupling between your UI and your application code. So your web designers don't have the freedom to do anything they want, because if they change the CSS selectors, you know, your app no longer works. And of course, you as a web developer, you want to write some behavior, you really have to talk to the web designers and say, please don't change these CSS selectors, otherwise my bindings won't work. And that kind of goes both ways. Now, in order to build a web app, you need to do three things. You need to be able to read values from the user. You need to be able to write to the DOM, which we have already demonstrated how we can do. And then you have to be able to talk XHR to the server. So let's look at how this is done using jQuery. So, you know, if you wanted to have a simple hello world, so you notice as I type, I'm updating the text, right? Typical stuff you want to do in an app. This is what jQuery code looks like. Basically, you have to declare your input, your destination. This is your callback function. This is what I'm talking about. You have to get hold of the two nodes inside of the DOM tree. This creates coupling between those two locations. Here's your update function, which simply reads the value from the input, concatenates it with a string, and assigns it to a greeting, piece of cake. Here comes my favorite part of this. Now, we want to do this on every keystroke, right? So we register a key down event. But this is where the knowledge of how browsers comes in, and you really have to know this. You have to say, okay, well, the event comes when the key is pushed, but that means the browser hasn't processed the event yet. So if I read the value from the input field at this point, I have the value that was there previously, not the one that it's about to get updated with. So I have to do a set timeout 0, right? In other words, I have to say, you browser, you do normal stuff. And then when you're done doing normal stuff, which is updating the input field, call me back so that I can read the value back out, right? Anybody feel like this is insanity? Right? This is complicated, right? It's not that it's complicated in a sense like, oh, this is so complex, you have to be a genius to work with. It's just like 20 million tiny little things you have to think about when you're building your web app. And this is one of them. And the end result of this is that when you look at the code, it's sprinkled with all these tiny little issues that you have to work around in the browser. And as an end result, the amount of code that you have, I'm going to argue that the only interesting piece of code in this app is this, right? So that's one line of interesting piece of code. Yet I have 5 lines of kind of glue code to put this together. right? So now I basically am going to argue that there's 80-20% rule, right? 80% of what you're going to write using technologies like jQuery or any technology for that matter that fundamentally gives you what the browser gives you underneath, 80% of it is going to be DOM manipulation, and 20% of it is going to be the actual code, right? And that's what we want to fix. So here's what the world looks like in Angular. Same exact behavior. Notice as I type, it updates, right? And notice what's happening over here. All I'm saying is, look, there's a first name, and it's bound to this location. Think like a spreadsheet, right? I don't mean just copy it now. I mean copy it anytime it changes in the future point in time. So this creates data binding, and turns out that data binding is the magical glue that allows you to decouple all kinds of things and simplify your application in significant ways. So notice it's almost no amount of code, and anybody looking at this can go and can grok, like, I understand what's going on, right? To grok what's going on over here, it takes a little bit of investigation. To grok what happens over here is pretty straightforward. Now, why is that? The reason is this is imperative code, right? You have to understand how the computer will execute this. This is declarative code. You say what you mean, right? And so what we want to do is as much as possible, we want to allow the user to be in declarative mode, right? I want the developer, or specifically the web designer, the guy who designs the way the application looks, to declaratively tell me how the app should render. On the other hand, the web developer, the guy who writes actual JavaScript, his favorite tool is JavaScript, and that's imperative because you want to say, what's the behavior when I click a particular button? Right? So you want to make sure that the only thing you have inside of your JavaScript is the actual behavior, and what you have inside of your HTML is instructions, declarative instructions on how to project the internal model. In this case, the model is just the first name, how to project that information to the UI so the user can consume. Let me give you a little more complicated example. So here is, you can select your greeting, and typing updates this. Similar things, notice again in jQuery how the actual interesting bits get drowned out from the all the DOM manipulation and listeners, etc. that you have to do. The other thing about this is that it's not exactly testable. There's things you could do for testability, but because this is an anonymous inner closure over here, it kind of makes testability difficult. And we'll talk about that some more. How many of you guys are into TDD? Oh, wow, pretty impressed. Okay, good. We thought about that as well. So same thing in Angular. Again, just data binding, doing the same exact job, much simpler stuff. So one of the things I wanted to point out is that, are we saying that jQuery is just the wrong way to building apps? And the answer is no, no, no. We love jQuery, right? jQuery, what it's fantastic at is DOM manipulation. But jQuery doesn't increase the level of abstraction. It's the same browser event system, the same browser DOM, the same everything that you have to think about. And building a web app is a lot more than DOM manipulation, right? It's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. And what we want to do is we want to take all of the DOM manipulation portion and allow you to express it declaratively in HTML. So I already pointed out, right? So AngularJS increases the level of abstraction, whereas jQuery just allows you to type less code. And that's the kind of the difference we want to go after, is how do we allow you to say what you mean rather than write a whole bunch of imperative code to do this work. Now, the last piece you need to do is you need to be able to do XHR, right? So I have a very simple service. So let's see, I'm going to say San Francisco. And every time I'm going to hit greet, it's going to send a string to the server, and a server will randomly choose a greeting, will prepend it, and send back a random greeting to the client, right? Typical things you want to do in a web app. This is done using jQuery. No, I'm lying. This is done using Angular. In jQuery, you know how you would do that, right? You would say, do .ajax call, and all the magical things would happen. The difference here is that in here, you get a hold of this XHR object, which is essentially just like the Ajax method call inside of jQuery, and you can perform your callback here. The difference is that the object here is injected, right? You simply say inside of a controller, in order to get my job done, I need this thing called XHR. And one will be handed to you. There's a registry of all the services we provide. One of them is XHR. By the way, you don't like our XHR implementation? No problem. You can override the service and it will provide you with whatever else you want. You can write your own implementation as well. But because it's injected, testability becomes really easy, because in my test I can simply say new greeter controller and give you a mock XHR, and then I can assert that, hey, the right stuff got called, and I can pretend to return the right things. This is not really possible with things like jQuery, because the only option you really have is to monkey patch the method. Or you can inject the method using, but then you're back to square one and you have to write your own injection service. So our controllers have a lot of things built in for testability as well. But here is where I would like you to stop thinking about these basic things and just think about it from completely different point of view. So far I've shown you these simple examples, like over here that basically says, data bind into salutation and name, and based on that, change this stuff. And, and there's a lot of different frameworks out there who do this, mainly in the form of you take some template, you take a model, you join the two together, and the template usually is a string. You take the model, you take the string, and you munge it together, and out comes another string, and then you go and you do inner HTML. Right? Angular is different because what it does is actually it says, well, the input is a DOM. I'm going to take a model and I'm going to munge them together, and the output of that is not actually a string or a DOM, but rather a linking function. And this linking function is a runtime representation of the bindings, so that if one of the two properties gets changed, the other one automatically gets updated. And this is important because if you're doing string concatenation, things are relatively simple, because you take if you're doing string concatenation, you take your input, you take your output, you manage it together, you get a string output, and you write to inner HTML. But once the user interacts with the page, and for example, if the inner HTML was an input box, it's not clear where the source of the truth lies anymore. Is it inside of the DOM because the user interacted with it, or is the source of the truth lie inside of the model? And so the second time around when you have to update, this becomes problematic. With Angular, because of the way data binding works, the source of the truth is always inside of the model. So how does this linking function work? Well, it turns out there's an HTML compiler that goes through and looks for certain patterns in the DOM. So in this particular case, there's a directive inside of the HTML that says, hey, when you come across a select or an input, I want you to register a bunch of listeners inside of something we call the scope, so that if those values change, I can go and update the UI. And similarly, it says, well, when you come across these double curlies inside of your text, convert them into spans with ngbind, and also set up our listeners on those variables. So if the value changes, go update the UI. The end result of this is that you can write your own bindings. So for example, wouldn't it be great if we could say, hey, in HTML, we have a zippy. And by default, the zippy is open, and it has a header, and it has a pane. And this is what you get rendered out of it, right? Browsers don't know what to do with this. Browsers are like, well, I've never seen this stuff. And they just kind of keel over and die and do nothing useful, right? But wouldn't it be great if you could give primitives to your web designers, right? You could say, oh, I just need a set of tabs. Just go ahead and put a bunch of tabs, instead of cut and pasting the concept of a tab all over the place. So what you can do in Angular is you can actually teach it new tricks. So you basically say, look, you come across an HTML element that has zippy, execute this behavior on top of it, so that with the magic of a little bit of CSS not shown, you can basically get the zippy that you want. In other words, we allow you to turn HTML into a DSL, right? A domain-specific language. You can write your own code. You can write your own behavior on top of it. I'm going to take a little detour for a second. Do you like the presentation over here? The HTML5 slide decks? I'm sure you've seen it many times before, right? Once before only? Oh, okay. I thought it was pretty popular on our web. I don't know who did this. We just kind of took this slide deck and we improved on it a little bit. Let me show you. Let's do view page source. It turns out this is an Angular app, and look what we get to do. We simply say body, and we say slide. And here's another slide, and another slide, right? So when we wanted to create a presentation, we created primitives that are useful for this type of application. So if I wanted to add a new slide into my presentation, I simply have to say slide, and off I go. This particular thing happens the way you expect. Now, this also creates proper deep linking. So if I refresh the page, I'm staying on the proper slide. I'm not going anywhere else, and so on. So the point I'm trying to say is that while it's tempted to think of AngularJS as a way of building web apps, what it actually is underneath is an HTML compiler, right? It allows you to come up with a syntax that is best suited for building your web application. If that means zippies, if it means slides, if it means whatever it happens to mean, you get to come up. So when you web designers go and start building a web app, they don't have to say, well, let's see, I need to create a zippy, which means I have to go and create this special CSS and this special class, and the div structure has to be in this following way, and so on. Okay, let's talk about testing for a second. So documents don't need to be tested, web apps do, right? So HTML is a static form system, and as a result, there's not much testing you get to do inside of it. But web applications have behaviors. In other words, declarative code, there isn't much to test about the declarative nature of things, but imperative code needs to be tested. So we help you in several ways. First of all, we let you declaratively specify the way things get rendered. In other words, that's the kind of stuff that you don't have to worry about testing. But also, we create a very clear separation between the controllers and the DOM manipulation. One thing that I wanted you to notice, and I forgot to mention, that if we go back to, here's a piece of code, right, which did the XHR. Notice how nowhere inside of the controller we have any references to DOM. Right? And that's great for testability because I can simply instantiate this, as I said, provide a mock, and off I go testing it without actually loading the UI. But you need both. You need a unit test, which proves that the particular behavior works, but you also need a test to prove that the data binding works. And we'll show you that in a second. So you need both end-to-end testing and a unit testing story for your application. And finally, we provide dependency injection. You know, I showed you how XHR got in there. How many of you guys familiar with what dependency injection is? How many people use it in JavaScript? Probably mostly in Java, huh? Okay, all right. Some people use it in JavaScript. Yes, so dependency injection, it's this amazing snake oil. Let me just sell you some snake oil. No, it's this amazing way of separating concerns. And what it allows you to do is, by separating things out, it actually becomes more testable, easier to understand. The other thing that's missing out of an Angular application is the main method, right? Every application has a main method on how to assemble all the pieces together. There is no main method in Angular because all of the information on how an application gets assembled is really inside of the metadata in forms of dependency injection. And it gets assembled for you automatically. So that when you come to a page, the compiler says, oh, look, there's a directive that says I need to go load a controller, and then loads the controller, and the controller says, well, but I need the following set of services in order to work, and tries to load the services. And the services, they can recursively say, but I need these other services for me to work as well. And the end result is that the whole app comes up without you ever having to specify a main method. The advantage of that is that if you have an app built this way and you decide, hey, you know, it would be really nice if for testing purposes I would skip the authentication part, you can easily override the authentication service with always authenticated, and all of a sudden your application works in always authenticated mode and it gets assembled in a different way. So as I said, we provide a unit testing framework and an end-to-end testing framework. But we're also very opinionated about the way applications should be built. And specifically, the sweet spot for Angular is CRUD application, right? So you wouldn't build a game using Angular, but CRUD is pretty much 90% of the web, maybe 80% of the web, right? It's the thing where you have a whole bunch of input forms and you want to show stuff to the user, maybe in the table format or something like that. And the CRUD is the sweet spot of the app. And so we provide not only the framework, but also a methodology of how to build together an application. So we provide you with something we call a seed application. It's very similar, if you're familiar with Ruby on Rails, where it generates kind of the seed, the directories, and kind of gets you started quickly. Similarly, we provide all the necessary pieces. So not only do you have a framework, but you also have a ways of unit testing out of the box and end-to-end testing out of the box. You know, something that's very different from most systems where they say, well, here's whatever the library does. Oh, testability, well, you're on your own. You can figure out your own story over there. So before I show you a couple of demos, the point I'm trying to make is that Angular is different in a sense that we don't want to abstract away HTML and JavaScript from you. We just want to make it easier to use, right? So we embrace HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and we decide that's the fundamental way of building a web app. And we do this by increasing level abstractions. We make your browsers testable, and we think about how to set up the APIs so that the right things just happen kind of out of the box. All right, let's do some demos before oh yeah. So pure JavaScript, there's no server-side component whatsoever, so you can work with anything you want on the server. As I said, it's two-part. It's the HTML compiler, which allows you to build up a DSL for what you need. And there's a framework that we kind of ship with the DSL compiler because we say, well, we think you're gonna need many of these components. And we're about 25K minified and gzipped, which means it's about the size of jQuery. We actually will use jQuery if you load jQuery inside of your page, we'll go through jQuery to modify the DOM. If you don't load the jQuery, we have our what we call jQuery Lite, which is like bare minimum implementation of jQuery, just so that we get to run the way you would expect. And the nice thing about it is it's not an all or nothing proposition like some frameworks are. Like for example, Sprout Core, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to put a little bit of Sprout Core on this page and this other page, I'm not going to use any. The nice thing about Angular is it follows the philosophy of jQuery, where you can sprinkle as much of it or as little of it on your web pages as you want. And if you have an existing app that you want to migrate from a round-trip app to an Ajax-style application, Angular actually works pretty well for that because you can start as a round-trip app, add dynamic behavior to existing pages, and then slowly migrate them to become more dynamic over time. We're pre 1.0 yet, so we're changing the APIs like crazy, and we are actually looking for some crazy JavaScript engineers at Google to work on this stuff. Thank you for attending. I hope you guys will get a chance to try it out. If you want to contact me, my email is, here we go. This is where you can check us out. If you want to contact me because you're interested in working on this cool project or you're interested in working for Google, just send me an email at Miško, M-I-S-K-O, @google.com. So, thank you.